Chapter 351. Money, 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 2. The woman's eyes widened in astonishment as an array of monster carcasses materialized before her, each more exotic and fearsome than the last. The pungent scent of preserved flesh and magical reagents filled the air, a testament to the freshness and quality of Lucavion's wares. A massive, scaled appendage unfurled across the polished wooden floor, its iridescent hide shimmering with an otherworldly luster. The woman's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the distinctive patterns of a frost wyrm, a creature found only in the frigid peaks of the northern reaches, far beyond Stormhaven's borders. Beside it lay the hulking form of a sandstorm behemoth, its rough, sandy exterior a stark contrast to the frost wyrm's sleek scales. The woman's gaze darted to its massive, crystalline claws, each one easily the size of a broadsword. Such a beast hadn't been seen in these parts for decades. By the gods, the woman breathed, her professional demeanor momentarily forgotten. Her eyes roamed over the impressive collection, taking in the shimmering scales of a thundercloud serpent, the wickedly curved horns of a shadow stalker, and the pulsing, ethereal core of what could only be a void elemental. Lucavion's smirk deepened, satisfaction glinting in his dark eyes. "I trust this qualifies as an opportunity worth your time?" The woman's gaze snapped back at him, a newfound respect evident in her expression. "Where did you get all this?" she asked, her voice hushed with awe and a touch of wariness. "A gentleman never reveals all his secrets," Lucavion replied smoothly, his smirk never faltering. "Let's just say I have my methods and leave it at that." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, but the allure of the rare materials before her was too strong to ignore. She straightened, her business acumen reasserting itself. "Very well. What exactly are you proposing?" Lucavion's gloved hand swept gracefully over the array of monster parts. "These materials are precisely what your adventurers need for the Duke's expedition. Rare, powerful, and most importantly, available right here, right now." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Imagine the advantage your guild could offer its members. While others scramble for scraps, your adventurers could be outfitted with the finest gear, crafted from materials most have only heard of in legends." The woman's eyes gleamed with interest, her mind clearly racing with the possibilities. "You make a compelling case," she said, her tone measured but unable to fully mask her excitement. "But such rare materials. The cost would be exorbitant." Lucavion's smile widened, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Ah, but that's where things get interesting. I'm not looking for just coin, my dear." The woman's brow furrowed. "No coin? Then what do you want in exchange?" "Nothing much. There are some materials that I need, that are really hard to find." "Some materials?" "Yup." The woman's gaze sharpened as she processed Lucavion's proposal, her hands resting lightly on the counter. "Is that the reason you came here?" she asked, her tone steady but laced with intrigue. Lucavion's smirk widened, his dark eyes gleaming with amusement. "You catch on fast," he replied smoothly, reaching into his coat once again. From within, he produced a folded parchment, its edges worn but the ink bold and precise. Unfolding it with deliberate care, Lucavion laid the parchment flat on the counter, revealing a detailed list of rare herbs and materials. The woman leaned in, her sharp eyes scanning the elegant script. With each name she read, her expression shifted, from curiosity to astonishment to disbelief. "This?" she murmured, her fingers tracing one of the names on the list. "These are outrageous," Lucavion supplied with a raised brow, his tone playful yet firm. "Yes, I thought you might say that." The woman's eyes darted back to the collection of rare monster carcasses sprawled across the floor, then to the list and back again. "You're offering us a 10% discount on some of the most sought-after materials we've seen in years. And in exchange, you expect us to procure these for you?" Her voice rose slightly, disbelief creeping into her otherwise professional tone. Lucavion's smirk didn't waver. If anything, it grew sharper, like a predator toying with its prey. "Precisely. Consider it a mutually beneficial arrangement. I provide your guild with an edge, and in return you acquire what I need. The woman shook her head, incredulous. Do you even realize what you're asking for? Some of these, she jabbed a finger at the list, her eyes narrowing, are not even that cheap for you to find. Ethereum shards from the Calamity Peaks? Do you have any idea what lengths we had to go to locate these? So you already knew their location. That saves a lot of time already, doesn't it? The woman's face flushed as she hastily covered her mouth, realizing her slip of the tongue. The weight of recent pressures and exhaustion had worn her down, leading to this momentary lapse, an embarrassing mistake for a guild master to make. She straightened, her professional composure quickly returning. But still, before she could finish, Lucavion moved, his steps deliberate and slow as he began gathering his materials. The fluidity of his actions spoke volumes, each motion a carefully choreographed display of dismissal. I see, he said smoothly, his voice tinged with feigned disappointment. You're not interested. It's a pity, really. I had hoped to work with the Adventurers Guild, considering I, myself, am an adventurer. But he glanced over his shoulder, his smirk returning. I suppose I'll take my business to the Merchants Guild. They've been known to make better offers already. The woman's eyes widened in alarm as she realized he was serious. Panic flared within her, the implications of losing such rare materials to their rivals flashing through her mind. Without thinking, she rushed forward, her hand darting out to grab his arm. No! She exclaimed, her voice more forceful than she intended. Lucavion stopped mid-step, turning his head to regard her with a raised brow. His smirk shifted into something almost teasing, his dark eyes gleaming with amusement. My lady, he said, his voice low and smooth, what should I take this for? An invitation for the night. The woman froze, her face reddening further as she quickly let go of his arm and stepped back. Ahem. She cleared her throat, fumbling to recover her dignity. That was not my intention. Lucavion's smirk widened, his gloved hand brushing his coat with exaggerated care. Ah, I see. My apologies, then. He inclined his head, his tone polite but still tinged with amusement. So what might I take it as, guild master? You knew, of course. Sigh. The woman straightened, regaining her composure. Consider it. She paused, choosing her words carefully. A signal of our willingness to negotiate. Lucavion tilted his head, his smirk softening into something more neutral but no less calculating. Well, in that case, I believe we can continue our discussion. The woman nodded curtly, relief flashing in her eyes as she gestured back toward the counter. Let's return to the matter at hand. I'll need more specifics on your requirements and what adjustments we might consider for this arrangement. Of course, Lucavion said, smoothly following her lead. As they resumed their positions at the counter, he leaned in slightly, his tone turning serious. Now, about those Ethereum shards. Inwardly, he mused at how easily the balance of power in negotiations could shift. Vital Yara's voice echoed faintly in his mind, carrying an edge of amusement. You really do enjoy this, don't you? Always, Lucavion thought with a smirk. The dance is what makes it fun. The guild master gestured toward a quieter corner of the guild hall, a small room enclosed by glass panels etched with intricate designs. Let's discuss this in private, she said, her tone professional as she led Lucavion inside. The room was modest but functional, with a heavy wooden table at its center surrounded by well-worn chairs. A single lamp cast a warm glow over the space, illuminating the stack of ledgers neatly piled on one side. Lucavion settled into a chair with his usual easy grace, his dark eyes following the guild master as she placed her own papers before her. She adjusted her spectacles, her fingers deftly flipping through the list of materials he had provided. Now, she began, glancing at the array of monster hides still spread out in the main hall, visible through the glass panels. Let's recount everything you've brought. The guild master ticked off each item on her list, her voice steady as she listed their properties and value. A frost WYRM hide, practically flawless. The scales of a thundercloud serpent, imbued with latent electricity. A sandstorm behemoth's claws, crystalline and still resonating with its elemental magic. And this, she paused, her gaze resting on the ethereal core of the void elemental. This alone is enough to fetch a small fortune. Lucavion leaned back in his chair, his smirk faint but ever-present. Impressive inventory skills. Now, what's your offer? She glanced up from her papers, her expression carefully neutral. For the lot, I'd propose 5,000 gold pieces. A fair price, considering the market and the rarity of these materials. Inwardly, Lucavion's smirk sharpened, though he showed no sign of emotion outwardly. 5,000, ambitious, aren't we? Vitaliera, he murmured in his thoughts. What do you think? Is she bluffing? Vitaliera, perched ethereally beside him, flicked her tail with a touch of amusement. Her vitality is stagnant, steady and calm, but it spiked briefly when you were about to leave. She's being cautious, but she's not lying. Lucavion nodded subtly, filing the observation away. This method, developed through his partnership with Vitaliera, had proven invaluable. By sensing fluctuations in a person's life force, they could gauge emotional spikes akin to how lie detectors on Earth monitored physical responses. He had proposed the idea after recalling stories of Earth's interrogation methods, though he hadn't revealed the source of his inspiration. At first, Vitaliera had dismissed the concept as absurd. Measuring lies through vitality? That's nonsense. But as Lucavion tested the technique repeatedly, and the results consistently aligned with his suspicions, even she had begrudgingly admitted its effectiveness. It's uncanny, she had once remarked. I still don't know how you thought of it. Lucavion's smirk deepened. Some secrets are best kept close, my dear. Returning to the present, Lucavion's dark eyes met the guild master's unflinchingly. 5,000, he repeated, his tone calm but carrying an edge of negotiation. It's a reasonable starting point, but considering the uniqueness of these materials, especially the void elemental core, I believe we can push for refinement of terms. The guild master arched an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. Refinement? Such as? Lucavion leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his gloved hands clasped. You've evaluated the lot well, but we both know the market demand for materials like these has surged. I'll agree to the 5,000 if, and only if, you commit to securing everything on my list until the expedition starts. The guild master hesitated, her fingers drumming against the table. That's a tight timeline. Indeed. Lucavion smiled faintly, his gaze steady. It's tight because it's necessary. These materials aren't for mere decoration, guild master. They're tools for survival. Survival? How are these related to survival? You seem perfectly fine. Well, someone else is not. But let's keep that confidential, shall we? Chapter 352. Took you long enough. The guild master's eyes lingered on Lucavion, her calculating gaze betraying the gears turning in her mind. She seemed to weigh her options, the quiet tension in the room thickening as her fingers resumed their rhythmic drumming against the table. Finally, she let out a resigned sigh, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I see your point, she said, her voice steadier now, though a hint of fatigue bled through her words. Tight or not, I suppose we don't have much leverage here. The materials you've brought, well, they speak for themselves. Lucavion inclined his head graciously, his smirk softening into something more neutral. A wise decision, guild master. I look forward to seeing how well the Adventurers Guild can handle a challenge. As she reached out to shake his hand, a flicker of realization crossed her face, and she froze momentarily. Ah, she murmured, pulling back slightly. I've been so preoccupied that I forgot something important. She stood, smoothing out her robes before extending her hand more formally. I never introduced myself. Guild Master Corvina Farrow. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. Lucavion rose with smooth elegance, clasping her hand firmly but not overly so. Lucavion, he replied, his tone light but polished. The pleasure is mutual, Guild Master Farrow. As their handshake lingered for a brief moment, Corvina's thoughts raced. Lucavion, An unusual name. But more than that, who exactly is this man? She stole a glance at him, noting his composed demeanor, the sharp intelligence in his eyes, and the subtle grace with which he carried himself. This wasn't the behavior of a simple merchant or trader. If he were a merchant's son, selling rare monster hides would make little sense. Too risky and without the connections required to gather such goods. No, there was only one plausible explanation. This young man was nobility. Likely one of those adventurous types who indulged in dangerous hobbies or sought to prove themselves outside their gilded lives. If that were the case, forging a formal connection with him could open doors she hadn't even considered. Her fingers briefly tightened around his as the realization settled in, her decision solidifying. She released his hand and gestured for him to sit again. Now that we've handled the introductions, let's finalize the terms. Lucavion resumed his seat, his smirk returning faintly as he noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor. She was guarded, yes, but there was a glimmer of respect, or perhaps curiosity, in her eyes now. Corvina continued, her tone measured but cordial. I'll ensure the guild prioritizes the items on your list, as you've requested, and I'll arrange for the agreed-upon payment for your materials. In return, I trust you'll keep our collaboration exclusive. Lucavion's smirk deepened. Exclusivity, Guild Master, is the cornerstone of any fruitful partnership. I didn't mention such a thing. Corvina clicked her tongue inwardly, frustration mingling with begrudging admiration. Just as I thought, this one doesn't miss a beat. She shook her head slightly, more to herself than to him, before reaching for her ledger and writing out a check for the payment. The sound of her quill scratching against the parchment filled the room as she worked, her movements precise and efficient. Sliding the completed check across the table, she met Lucavion's gaze. This is a draft for the total amount. You can collect your payment from the Central Arcanis Bank. It should suffice for our agreement. Lucavion took the check with practiced ease, his movements graceful as he folded it neatly and tucked it into his coat. With a slight flourish, he placed the spatial ring on the table and pushed it toward her. Here, he said, his voice smooth, you may verify the contents. Corvina eyed him carefully before taking the ring, her fingers brushing its surface. She activated it with a subtle twist of her mana, and an array of monstrous remains shimmered into view within the ring's storage. As she scanned the contents, her eyes widened slightly. Everything he had presented earlier was here, in pristine condition. The Frost WYRM, the Void Elemental Core, and every other piece he had mentioned. It's all here, she murmured, almost to herself. Efficient, thorough, and precise. Just what I'd expect from someone like him. Satisfied, Corvina nodded and returned the ring to him. You've delivered as promised. The guild will honor its side of the agreement. Lucavion slipped the ring back onto his finger with a faint smile. A pleasure doing business with you, Guild Master. As he rose to leave, he paused and turned back to her. Before I go, I have a favor to ask. Corvina's brow arched, suspicion flickering across her face. A favor? She leaned back slightly, her arms crossing. And what might that be? Lucavion's smirk didn't falter. As I've mentioned, I'm an adventurer under this guild's registry. Therefore, I'd like my rank updated to be Rank B. Corvina's eyes narrowed. What was your previous rank? Lucavion shrugged lightly, his smirk never fading. Rank D. You do realize that upgrading from D to B requires examinations, don't you? And you're skipping rank C entirely. Indeed I do, Lucavion replied smoothly. But these monsters should speak for themselves, no? Do you think a normal person could capture them? Corvina tapped her fingers against the table, her tone turning more stern. Mr. Lucavion, while these materials are impressive, they don't serve as proof that you killed these creatures yourself. Even though we're conducting business, rank advancement requires adherence to guild regulations. Without confirmation of your involvement, you'll need to undergo the necessary examinations. Lucavion tilted his head slightly, considering her words before a new spark of mischief lit his eyes. I see. Then, let's change the conditions. Corvina frowned, her suspicion returning in full force. Change the conditions? To what? Lucavion leaned in slightly, his tone calm but with a faint undertone of intrigue. If possible, issue me a new ID card with a new name. Corvina's eyes widened in shock, her composure slipping for just a moment. A new name? You do know that identity fraud is a dangerous crime, right? Lucavion coughed softly, a hand rising to his mouth in a gesture of mock propriety. What crime, Miss Corvina? I simply wish to delay certain reactions. Corvina's brow furrowed, her suspicion deepening. Why? What are you trying to avoid? Well, Lucavion began, his tone light but laced with something heavier. Let's just say I've encountered someone from my past. Someone I'm not quite ready to confront yet. Would that suffice as an explanation? The guild master leaned back slightly, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Someone from your past. She crossed her arms, her tone skeptical. Mr. Lucavion, you're making me think you're a criminal. Lucavion smirked, his dark eyes gleaming with amusement. Miss Corvina, surely you don't know my name? Should I? She asked, her voice flat. Are you supposed to be famous? Lucavion's smirk widened, carrying a faint edge of self-satisfaction. Ah, so the news hasn't reached here yet? I suppose the east is quite far from the west. Allow me to drop a hint. He leaned back in his chair, his tone turning almost conspiratorial. Cloud Heaven's sect. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and Corvina's breath caught. Her composed demeanor wavered, her fingers tightening imperceptibly on the edge of the table. Cloud Heaven's sect? She repeated, her voice low, almost disbelieving. You're affiliated with them? Lucavion chuckled softly, his gloved fingers tapping a faint rhythm against the armrest of his chair. But he didn't answer. Corvina stared at Lucavion, her thoughts churning as she pieced together the fragments of information he'd let slip. Her fingers drummed against the table as realization dawned, her sharp mind connecting the dots. A sudden flicker of recognition sparked in her eyes, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Sword Demon. Lucavion's smirk didn't waver, but his dark eyes gleamed with a hint of satisfaction. He said nothing, letting her fill the silence with her thoughts. The name was infamous, a moniker whispered across the empire. A mysterious figure who had risen to prominence seemingly overnight, cutting through the Andelheim tournament like a blade through silk. He'd single-handedly confronted members of the Cloud Heavens sect, a force few dared to oppose, and walked away unscathed. Corvina's breath caught as her mind raced. Some even held him responsible for the witch hunt, the brutal purge initiated by Marquis Venter and the Olarian family against Cloud Heaven's sect. The devastation it left in its wake has been being felt across the entire empire, and it is still going on. And that man's name, Lucavion, she murmured, her gaze sharpening as she took him in anew. The scar tracing his cheek, the piercing black eyes, the raven-black hair that framed his sharp features. It all matched. And the sheer quantity of rare monster hides and cores he'd casually produced? It made too much sense. Her hands gripped the edge of the table as she stared at him, her voice rising slightly. You're the Sword Demon. Lucavion's smirk widened into a grin, and he inclined his head slightly, a gesture of mock humility. Took you long enough, Guild Master. Chapter 353. Took you long enough? 2. Corvina felt heat rise to her cheeks, a rare wave of embarrassment washing over her as she realized the glaring oversight she'd made. How could I miss something so blatant? The pieces had been right in front of her. His name, his appearance, his casual confidence, and the sheer weight of the materials he'd presented. She prided herself on her sharp instincts, yet today she'd been caught off guard more than once. It wasn't just frustrating, it was unacceptable. She shook her head sharply, willing herself to focus as she straightened her posture. Clearing her throat, she folded her hands on the table, her gaze locking onto Lucavion. Surely, she began, her tone edged with exasperation. You could have mentioned this earlier. Lucavion didn't falter. If anything, it deepened, carrying a teasing lightness that only fueled her irritation. Then the fun would have been lost, he replied, his tone silky and unapologetic. Corvina stared at him, her lips pressing into a thin line as her mind scrambled for a response. Finally, she exhaled a slow, measured breath, letting her frustration melt away. "You're impossible," she muttered, shaking her head again. "I can't decide if you're brilliant or insufferable." Lucavion leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes glinting with amusement. "Why not both?" Her hand twitched as though tempted to throw something at him, but she refrained. No, keep your composure, Corvina. You're the guild master." She rubbed her temples briefly before dropping her hands to the table. "Regardless of your penchant for theatrics, Mr. Lucavion, the fact remains. This guild operates on structure and rules. And despite your reputation, you're not exempt from them." Lucavion inclined his head slightly, his smile softening into something more neutral but no less confident. "Of course, guild master. I would expect nothing less." But then his smile deepened as he leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes glinting with a mix of mischief and insight. "Rules, guildmaster," he said smoothly, his voice like silk laced with steel, "are meant to be bent. As long as it's convenient, of course. Surely, you and I both understand this. Don't we, Miss Corvina?" Corvina narrowed her eyes at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. She wanted to protest, to retort with some defense of structure and order, but she couldn't. The truth of his words struck a chord she couldn't deny. The world of adventurers, merchants, and nobles was riddled with exceptions, loopholes, and quiet agreements made behind closed doors. She'd played that game herself more times than she cared to admit. And now, sitting across from the man known as the Sword Demon, she realized she was about to play it again. "I suppose," she began, her tone measured but edged with reluctant amusement, "there's a certain pragmatism in what you're saying." Lucavion chuckled softly, reclining slightly in his chair as though he had already won. "Pragmatism is the foundation of progress, Miss Corvina. You know it, I know it. Why pretend otherwise?" Corvina sighed inwardly. He was insufferable, yes, but also undeniably sharp. She had stated the dangers of issuing a new identity for formality's sake earlier, yet now that she knew who he was, her perspective shifted. This man wasn't just some rogue adventurer or ambitious merchant's son. He was the Sword Demon, a figure whose reputation could open doors or burn them to ash. As long as this matter remained small and contained, the risks were manageable. And keeping someone like Lucavion in her guild's good graces? That could yield benefits she hadn't even begun to imagine. Her instincts whispered to her, a faint thrill tingling at the edge of her thoughts. This man will make things much, much more interesting, if not entirely unpredictable. "Fine," Corvina said at last, her voice steady. "I'll see to your request, Mr. Lucavion. But I'll hold you to your word. This new identity stays within the boundaries of reason. If it leads to anything that compromises my guild or its reputation." She trailed off, her tone carrying an unspoken warning. Lucavion inclined his head, his smirk softening into something almost charming. "Of course, guild master, you have my word." Corvina studied him for a moment longer, her sharp gaze searching for any hint of deceit. All she found was confidence, and a glimmer of something more, something dangerous yet undeniably magnetic. She shook her head, more to herself than to him, and rose from her chair. "I'll prepare the necessary documentation," she said briskly. "And while I'm at it, I'll make sure your dealings with the guild are logged." Discreetly, Lucavion stood as well, his movements fluid and unhurried. "Much appreciated, Miss Corvina. I knew I was in capable hands the moment I walked through your doors." Her lips twitched in a faint smile despite herself. "Just try not to make me regret it." Lucavion chuckled as he adjusted his coat, his dark eyes glinting with intrigue. "Regret? Miss Corvina, I promise only one thing. I'll make sure you're never bored." Just as Lucavion reached the door, his boots clicking softly against the polished floor, Corvina's voice halted him. "Wait," she called, her tone laced with a mix of curiosity and practicality. "Is there a name you'd prefer for this new identity?" Lucavion paused mid-step, turning his head slightly to glance over his shoulder. A faint smile played on his lips as he seemed to consider her question. Finally, he turned fully, his dark eyes glinting with something between amusement and calculation. "Let's go with Luca." Corvina raised an eyebrow. "Luca? Isn't that a little similar to your real name?" Lucavion's smile deepened, his tone carrying a quiet confidence. "Sometimes, similarities are often the ones overlooked." She gave him a skeptical look, her arms crossing as she leaned against the table. "I don't agree with you, but whatever. It's your identity. I just hope this doesn't come back to bite me." Lucavion chuckled softly, inclining his head in a gesture of polite acknowledgement. "Oh, don't worry, Guildmaster. If anything bites, I promise to take full responsibility." Corvina rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress the faint twitch of a smile. "Fine. Luca, it is. I'll make the arrangements." "Thank you, Miss Corvina," Lucavion replied smoothly, tipping an imaginary hat as he turned back toward the door. "Until we meet again." As the door closed behind him, Corvina let out a long sigh, her thoughts swirling. Luca. Huh? She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a deal with the devil, or perhaps someone even more unpredictable. And yet, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of anticipation. Never bored indeed. Lucavion stepped out into the cool night air, the door of the Adventurers Guild clicking softly shut behind him. The faint hum of activity in Stormhaven's harbor filled the silence, lanterns flickering as the wind carried the salty tang of the ocean. From a nearby shadow, Vitaliera emerged in a shimmer of light, her ethereal form bounding effortlessly onto his shoulder. She perched there with her usual grace, her tail curling loosely around his neck. Her glowing eyes narrowed as she regarded him. "Why did you decide to hide your name, Lucavion?" she asked, her tone pointed. "If you were going to drop that sword demon hint later, wouldn't it have been better to hide it from the start?" Lucavion smirked, adjusting his coat as he began walking down the cobblestone street. "No, this is just a temporary convention," he replied, his tone calm but deliberate. "A convention?" Vitaliara's tail flicked in exasperation. "You and your cryptic nonsense. You're not even trying to hide that there's more to this, are you?" "Perhaps," Lucavion said with a faint chuckle, his dark eyes scanning the lively streets ahead. "But not every question needs an answer, Vitaliera. You should know that by now." Her glow brightened slightly as she bristled. "I'm your familiar, remember? You can't just leave me out of your schemes and expect me not to ask questions." Lucavion sighed, his smirk fading into a faintly amused smile. "And I've told you before, my dear, that some secrets are safer kept within my mind." Her glow brightened as she swung herself down, dangling upside down from his shoulder to meet his gaze directly. Is this related to that blonde girl?" Lucavion hesitated for a heartbeat, a pause so subtle that it could have been missed by anyone less attuned to him than Vitaliera. "No comment," he said at last, his voice quiet but firm. "No comment? Really?" Vitaliara's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the soft glow of her form flickered, reflecting her annoyance. But she didn't press further. Instead, she adjusted her perch and sighed, her tail swaying lazily. "Impossible, just like your master. No, you are worse than him." "I will take it as an honor," he quipped, a faint grin tugging at his lips. They walked on in comfortable silence, the rhythm of their footsteps blending with the distant sound of waves. Above them, the stars glittered faintly, their cold light illuminating the path ahead. Vitaliara's voice broke the quiet, softer this time. "Lucavion, you've always been like this. Calculating, strategizing, keeping so much of yourself locked away. Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" Lucavion's smirk softened, his gaze lifting to the horizon. "Worth is a strange thing, Vitaliera. It's fluid, subjective. For now, it's enough that I know where I stand." "And where's that?" she asked, her voice quieter still, almost gentle. "Well, that is something for you to figure out." Chapter 354, What He Was Doing. Lucavion continued his unhurried stroll through the lively streets of Stormhaven, Vitaliera perched on his shoulder like a regal warden. The flickering lantern light danced across the cobblestones, casting shadows that seemed to play a silent game of tag. "We've come far tonight," Lucavion remarked, his voice soft as he took in the vibrant city around him. "And we still have further to go," Vitaliera replied, her glowing eyes sweeping over the bustling streets. "But first, rest. I can feel your weariness, Lucavion." Indeed, just as Vitaliera had stated, Lucavion had been working nonstop in the last 5 months of traveling time. After all, traveling from west to east was not something that could happen in a short amount of time, especially without having the machinery or other products that made traveling convenient. Even though Ether was really one of the finest mounts and she was quite strong and fast, even she had limits. And Lucavion, in fact, was not someone to waste any opportunity to get stronger. He gave a slight nod, acknowledging her concern. "True enough. Let's find an inn." Lucavion continued his measured stride through the streets, his gaze distant but sharp, his thoughts delving into the countless days and nights he'd spent on this journey. The flickering lanterns cast fleeting shadows over his figure, his silhouette blending with the bustling vibrancy of Stormhaven. "You've driven yourself relentlessly these past months," Vitaliera noted, her voice calm but tinged with concern. Her glowing eyes flitted over his features, catching the faint lines of weariness he carried with his usual poise. Even Ether needed her moments of respite. "But you've barely paused, Lucavion." "It's necessary," he replied, his voice low but resolute. "The path between Westward Range and the Eastern Realms isn't a leisurely stroll, and there's little use in letting opportunities go to waste." Indeed, the journey had been grueling. The roads that connected the sprawling cities were anything but safe, infested with monsters that turned the wilderness into a treacherous expanse. These creatures, the bane of common travelers and weaker adventurers, had been a constant source of opportunity for Lucavion. He had deliberately chosen less traveled paths, navigating through valleys and over ridges where danger was almost guaranteed. For the average person or even a lesser awakened, it would have been madness. But for Lucavion, it was a calculated investment. Every encounter had been a test of strength, each monster a stepping stone in his relentless pursuit of growth. The flame of Equinox, his core that harmonized the opposing forces of life and death, had grown stronger with each battle. Yet, frustratingly, he remained just shy of a breakthrough to the coveted 4-star level. The monsters he faced, even at their peaks, lacked the potency required to fuel that next step. Still, the hunt had not been fruitless. Where his flame of Equinox faltered, his devourer of stars core thrived. The starlight mana within him had grown sharper, more polished, and more aligned with his unique physique. As he fought and refined, his cultivation advanced rapidly. "It's ironic," he mused, a faint smile curving his lips. "A technique meant to honor my master. Yet it has started becoming something entirely my own." The Devourer of Stars was no longer a rigid method. It had evolved under his hand, tailored to his unique energy pathways and physical constitution. He drew power from the stars themselves, their light transmuted into mana that resonated with the core of his being. Each refinement made the technique more his, shaping it into a tool perfectly suited for him. "You're on the verge," Vitaliera said, interrupting his thoughts. Her tail swayed gently, her tone thoughtful. "I can feel it. Your starlight mana. It's different now, brighter, more focused. You've pushed it to a point where it's almost ready to bloom into something greater." Lucavion nodded faintly. "Almost isn't enough. Not yet, but soon." "And the flame of Equinox?" she pressed, her voice quieter now. "You've come so far, but you've also neglected rest. If you don't find balance, even the strongest flames can burn out." His smirk deepened, though there was no mockery in it, only a quiet acceptance. "Balance is the whole essence of that flame, Vitaliera. I'm well aware. But this stagnation won't last. The right challenge is out there, waiting, and indeed, after all, he came to his city to achieve 2 things. 1, to save a certain daughter, and 2, to achieve his breakthrough. The 2 made their way to the heart of the city, where the finest accommodations were clustered. It didn't take long to locate a well-lit establishment with a polished sign swaying gently in the night breeze. the golden ember. Its inviting glow promised comfort and reprieve. Stepping inside, Lucavion paused, his sharp gaze scanning the room. The spacious interior was bustling with activity, a hum of conversation rising above the clink of glasses and the soft strumming of a lute in the corner. What caught his attention, however, were the auras. Strong ones, awakened. Lucavion's dark eyes swept the room, lingering on the flickering intensity of awakened auras scattered throughout. Each pulse of power was a subtle beacon, revealing the diverse calibers of those gathered in the golden ember's common hall. His smirk deepened, though his demeanor remained composed. "Well, well," he murmured, stepping further into the room, his boots clicking softly against the polished wooden floor. "It seems Stormhaven has become a convergence point. These are no ordinary travelers," Vitaliera observed, her voice low but edged with interest. Her glowing gaze flitted from one awakened to the next, noting the diversity of energy signatures. "Some are strong enough to rival you. And look there." She nodded toward a table in the corner, where a figure sat with an enormous shadowy wolf curled at their feet. "Even familiars are present." Lucavion tilted his head slightly, acknowledging her observation. "The Duke's expedition must have garnered more attention than I anticipated. Such a gathering of power is rarely a coincidence, or an entirely safe one," Vitaliera added. Her tail flicked lightly as she perched higher on his shoulder. "Not everyone gathered here will be an ally, or even neutral." "True enough," Lucavion said, his tone unhurried. "But the more, the merrier. Wouldn't you agree?" "Vigilance is better," she countered, her voice sharp with caution. "Not everyone here has good karma, and I doubt their interests will align with ours." Lucavion chuckled softly, the sound a blend of amusement and calculation. "Karma is a luxury we can overlook for now. As long as they're useful, their sins don't concern me. That being said, I'll take note of the most intriguing among them." "You'd better," Vitaliera said, her tone tinged with quiet resignation. Human nature rarely changes. He didn't argue. Instead, he made his way to the counter, securing a room with his usual effortless charm. The innkeeper, a stout woman with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, gave him the key but not without a brief, appraising glance at Vitaliera. "It's rare to see such a creature in these parts," she remarked casually, though her tone carried a subtle edge. Lucavion's smirk softened into something polite yet distant. "A rarity, perhaps, but one that prefers her privacy." The woman gave a curt nod, handing over the key without further comment. Ascending the staircase, Lucavion's thoughts remained on the room below. Each aura he'd sensed was a piece in the larger puzzle he'd come here to solve. The daughter he sought to save and his own imminent breakthrough. They were tied to the city's convergence of power, and he would navigate its web with precision. Reaching the room, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was modest but well-appointed, with sturdy furniture and a large window that overlooked the lively streets below. Setting his pack down, he glanced at Vitaliera, who had leaped gracefully onto the windowsill. And then he mumbled while posing to take his clothes out. Lucavion began unbuckling his coat with deliberate slowness, his smirk deepening as he caught Vitaliera's sharp gaze from the windowsill. "Shouldn't I get some privacy?" he asked, his tone dripping with playful mischief. "Or would you rather stay here, you peeping cat?" "Vitality incarnate does not peep," Vitaliera shot back, her tail flicking sharply. "And I am not a cat." Lucavion chuckled, neatly folding his coat before moving to unbutton his shirt. "You may not be a peeping cat, but you're certainly a peeping Tom." Her glowing eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening with indignation. "Peeping Tom? What is that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," he replied smoothly, though the glint in his eye said otherwise. "Why do I feel offended?" she demanded, her tail curling tighter around her paws as she stared him down. "Must be your imagination," he said with a shrug, his voice laced with mock innocence. "I wouldn't dream of offending you, Vitaliera." Her glow brightened slightly, signaling her simmering irritation. "For someone so smart, you're remarkably annoying sometimes. That's what makes me charming," he quipped, neatly setting his shirt aside before pulling a fresh tunic from his pack. "But since you're so insistent, I'll forgive your trespasses this time. Vitaliera does not trespass," she retorted, lifting her chin as if her very pride were at stake. "And certainly not for someone as insufferable as you." Lucavion's laughter was low and warm as he tugged the tunic over his head. "You wound me truly, but I suppose I'll survive. Survival is the least of your concerns," she muttered, turning her gaze to the streets below as if dismissing him entirely. But the faint flick of her tail betrayed her lingering irritation, and maybe, just maybe, a touch of amusement. Lucavion leaned against the edge of the bed, watching her with a lazy grin. "You're adorable when you're flustered, Vitaliera." "I am never flustered," she snapped, her glow flaring indignantly. "And certainly not by you." "Of course not," he replied, his grin widening. "Just as I'm not insufferable." Her silence spoke volumes, but when she finally turned back to him, her eyes gleamed with a spark of begrudging humor. "One of these days, Lucavion, your wit will get you into trouble." "It usually does," he agreed with a smirk. "But isn't that half the fun?" She didn't have anything to say about that. Chapter 355. You Are Allowed. 3 days later, Duke's Mansion. Inside the Duke's Mansion, a room was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic crash of waves against the distant shore. Eliana sat by her bed, her slender form draped in her usual heavy robe. She leaned back against the cushioned headboard, her breathing even as she stared blankly at the ceiling. Suddenly, a sharp pain erupted in her chest, like a claw tearing through her lungs. Her eyes widened as she clutched at her throat, gasping for air. Before she could cry out, a wet, metallic taste filled her mouth. Burk dash. A violent cough racked her body, and when she pulled her hand away, it was stained crimson. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the blood on her palm, her vision blurring. Panic seized her as she doubled over, trembling. The door burst open, and her maid, Liana, rushed in, her face pale with worry. "My lady!" she exclaimed, dropping to her knees at Eliana's side. Without hesitation, she reached for the small vial of medicine kept on the bedside table. "Here," the maid said urgently, uncorking the vial and pressing it into Eliana's shaking hands. "Drink this, it will help." Eliana's fingers fumbled with the vial as she tried to steady herself. The maid gently guided her hands, helping her tilt the vial to her lips. The thick, bitter liquid burned as it slid down her throat, but the effect was immediate. Her coughing subsided, though her chest still ached, and her breaths came in uneven gasps. As the medicine took hold, Eliana's strength waned, and she slumped forward, her balance faltering. The maid instinctively reached out to steady her, her hands warm and firm against Eliana's trembling frame. But as she did that, she made a mistake. While trying to help her, she slightly moved her veil, and to that, the maid's eyes widened as her gaze fell on Eliana's exposed skin for a split second. The blackened lines and cracked pores that marred her pale skin were stark and jarring. Despite her attempts to hide it, the illness's cruel marks were impossible to miss. It was really disgusting, completely against a person's eyes and sense of art. Her expression betrayed her shock, her lips parting slightly as her eyes flicked between Eliana's hands and the veil that barely concealed her torment. And that was something that Eliana had always been familiar with. The same gaze that the maid had at that time was the same gaze that everyone had thrown at her when she had first gotten her illness. To that, Eliana's reaction was swift and sharp. "Don't touch me," she hissed, slapping the maid's hands away with what little strength she had left. Her voice was laced with anger, but beneath it was a raw vulnerability that sent the maid recoiling. Eliana's trembling hands reached for the veil she had discarded earlier, pulling it over her face in one swift motion. Her fingers tugged the fabric into place, ensuring every inch of her face was concealed. She turned away from the maid, her breathing still labored, but her movements were frantic and defensive. Her expression betrayed her shock, her lips parting slightly as her eyes flicked between Eliana's hands and the veil that barely concealed her torment. "Out!" Eliana snapped, her voice sharp and trembling. "Get out! Now!" "My lady," the maid began, her voice faltering as she reached out again. "Leave!" Eliana's shout rang through the room, raw and desperate. She turned her face further away, her hands clenching into fists against her lap. "I don't need your pity. Just go." The maid hesitated for a moment, her expression filled with both guilt and helplessness. Finally, she lowered her gaze and stood, stepping back toward the door. "As you wish, my lady," she murmured softly before slipping out of the room and closing the door behind her. As the silence returned, Eliana slumped against the bed, her body trembling from exhaustion and the aftermath of her outburst. She pulled her veil tighter around her face, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. As the door clicked shut and the maid's hesitant footsteps faded down the hall, silence reclaimed the room. The air felt heavy, thick with unspoken emotions and the lingering taste of bitter medicine. Eliana's trembling hands moved with practiced urgency, pulling the veil tighter around her face, tucking it securely to hide every inch of exposed skin. Her fingers, still shaking, adjusted her sleeves and the hem of her robe, ensuring not a sliver of her discolored, cracked skin was visible. Each motion was precise, almost mechanical, born from years of necessity. But with every adjustment, her chest tightened, a deep, seething hatred simmering within her. Not for the maid, not for her illness, for the veil, for the layers of fabric that imprisoned her. Her fists clenched against the thick fabric of her robes as she turned and slumped onto the bed. The ornate headboard loomed above her like a monument to everything she despised. She pulled her knees to her chest, curling into herself, her face buried against her legs. The veil brushed against her skin, a constant reminder of its presence, suffocating and oppressive. She despised it with every fiber of her being, yet she couldn't bear to remove it. Not after what she'd seen on the maid's face, that flicker of revulsion, no matter how quickly the girl had tried to hide it. "They always look at me like that," she thought bitterly, her mind racing back to memories she had tried to bury. The first time she had stepped out of her room after the marks began to spread. The way the servants averted their eyes, the whispered murmurs she wasn't meant to hear. Disgusting. How tragic. She's not even human anymore. Her arms tightened around her knees as if she could make herself smaller, as if she could disappear entirely. She didn't cry. There were no tears left for this. No energy to mourn a life that had long since slipped away. She simply stayed like that, curled into a fragile ball, her breathing shallow and uneven. The minutes stretched on, the room enveloped in a heavy silence broken only by the faint crash of waves in the distance. Eliana didn't move. She didn't need to. This was familiar, too familiar. It was how she had always coped. No tears, no screams, just silence and stillness. If she stayed like this long enough, maybe the ache in her chest would fade. Maybe the suffocating weight of the veil would become bearable again. Maybe. Knock. But it appeared that even that little time was just too much for her. The knock on the door echoed through the suffocating silence of the room, pulling Eliana from the fog of her thoughts. Her body tensed as a familiar voice followed the knock, deep and authoritative yet with a measured gentleness. Eliana. She recognized it instantly, her father, the Duke. Her breath hitched as she scrambled to pull the blanket over herself, covering her body entirely. The thought of him seeing her like this, vulnerable and exposed, filled her with a sharp, aching dread. Once she was sufficiently hidden beneath the thick fabric, her voice, though strained, cut through the air. "Enter." The door creaked open, and the Duke stepped inside, his presence commanding as always. He paused in the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the room before landing on her huddled figure on the bed. His gaze lingered for a moment, and though his expression was unreadable, there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. "You had one of your attacks again, didn't you?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with quiet worry. Eliana's lips pressed into a thin line, her body curling further beneath the blanket. "What does it matter?" she snapped, her tone sharp and unwelcoming. "You've seen it enough times. It's nothing new." The Duke exhaled a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging slightly as he crossed the room. He stopped a few paces from the bed, his imposing figure casting a shadow over her fragile frame. "It matters because you matter," he said, his tone softening slightly. "Even when you refuse to believe it." Eliana didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the corner of the blanket she clutched tightly in her hands. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths as her father's words hung in the air. The Duke straightened, his demeanor shifting back to one of authority. "I came to inform you that the vantage point you requested has been arranged. Everything is ready." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, a faint spark of surprise breaking through her guarded expression. "Already?" she asked, her voice low and skeptical. "Yes," he replied, nodding. "You'll have Madeline at your side, as well as a contingent of knights to ensure your safety. The location is secure, and I've made certain it will provide the view you desired." Eliana's fingers tightened around the blanket, pulling it higher as if to shield herself from his gaze. "I don't need her," she said curtly. "Or the knights." "You do," the Duke countered firmly. "And you will have them. This isn't negotiable." Her lips curled into a faint scowl, but she didn't argue further. There was no point, his decisions, once made, were immutable. "I've also had cloaks and veils prepared," he added, gesturing briefly toward a neatly folded bundle in the corner of the room. "They will ensure you're properly covered and shielded from the elements. And from prying eyes." The mention of the veils made her stomach twist, a bitter taste rising in her throat. Still, she nodded reluctantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fine." The Duke's gaze lingered on her, his sharp features etched with a mix of authority and concern. He crossed his arms, his imposing figure casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the room. "The recruitment for the expedition will be finalized by tomorrow," he stated firmly. "After that, we move. Make sure you are in good condition by then." Eliana's fingers clenched tighter around the blanket, her knuckles whitening as she straightened slightly. Her voice, though quiet, carried an edge of determination. "I will not miss it." The Duke's brow furrowed slightly at her words, his expression unreadable. A pause hung heavy between them, the silence broken only by the faint crash of waves outside the window. "Is that so?" he finally said, his voice calm but laden with something inscrutable. Eliana held his gaze for a moment, her heart thudding in her chest. The tension in the air was palpable, her father's words carrying a weight she couldn't entirely decipher. "Yes," she replied, her tone steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'll be ready." The Duke exhaled, his broad shoulders relaxing just slightly as he regarded her. "See that you are," he said, his voice softer now. "This is not a place for hesitation or frailty. If you cannot manage yourself, there will be no second chances." Eliana's jaw tightened, her teeth clenching behind her veil. "I understand." Chapter 356. Recruitment. The streets of Stormhaven were alive with the energy of the bustling city, even in the late evening. The salty tang of the sea mixed with the sense of grilled fish and spices from nearby food stalls. Lanterns hung from wrought iron posts, their flickering light casting long shadows on the cobblestones. Merchants packed up their stalls, sailors swapped tales of their voyages, and the occasional drunkard wobbled through the streets, adding to the symphony of city life. Alara walked quietly beside Cedric, her thoughts lingering on their destination. The recruitment station for the Duke's expedition loomed in her mind like a beacon and a test. She was supposed to have reported there yesterday, but circumstances had conspired against her. She glanced at Cedric, his expression stoic and watchful as always. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of gratitude, though she kept her voice steady. "I still can't believe that stew was poisoned." Cedric's lips twitched into a small, wry smile. "It wasn't poisoned, Lady Alara. It was just bad meat, likely left out in the sun for too long." Alara sighed, a hand brushing over her stomach instinctively. "It certainly felt like poison. I've never been so sick in my life. If not for you." Her voice trailed off, but Cedric's response was immediate. "It's my duty," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for debate. "You shouldn't concern yourself with what's already past. You're well now, and that's what matters." Well enough to walk all over Stormhaven, she muttered under her breath, earning a chuckle from Cedric. Better to be cautious, Lady Alara. You don't want to fall ill again before the expedition begins. She nodded, though her thoughts wandered back to the ordeal. She had been so excited to arrive in Stormhaven, ready to begin her final trial, only to be laid low by an unfortunate meal. It had been embarrassing, to say the least. If not for Cedric's quick thinking and steady presence, she doubted she would have recovered so quickly. Her attention returned to the present as they turned a corner, the sounds of the recruitment station reaching her ears before the building came into view. The unmistakable clang of weapons and the rumble of raised voices drifted through the air. Ahead, the recruitment station was a large stone structure with banners bearing the crest of the Thaddeus Duchy. A sea serpent coiled around a trident. The open courtyard in front of the building was crowded with adventurers, mercenaries, and soldiers, all vying for attention. Torches burned brightly along the perimeter, casting a warm glow over the scene. Cedric slowed his pace, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. It seems we're not the only ones interested in this expedition, he remarked. Alara pulled her hood tighter around her face, her nerves stirring once more. Do you think we're too late? That they've already filled the positions? I doubt it, Cedric replied, his tone steady. The Duke would have closed the recruitment. Besides, his hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword. We're more than qualified. They'll see that. Alara nodded, though the knot in her stomach tightened. This was it, the first step of her trial. She took a deep breath, pushing aside the lingering fatigue from her recent illness. As they approached the gates of the station, a guard in polished armor stepped forward, his expression firm but professional. State your names and purpose, he barked, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. Alara took a steadying breath and stepped forward, pulling a small, weathered card from her pocket. She held it out to the guard, who squinted at the adventurer ID under the flickering torchlight. The card simply read Alara and bore her rank, D rank. The edges of the card were slightly frayed, evidence of frequent use. Cedric stepped forward as well, presenting an identical card with the same rank and just his first name, Cedric. The guard inspected them both briefly before his gaze flicked back to Alara. His eyes narrowed as he noted the faint shimmer of her mana under her cloak. A mage? He asked, his tone tinged with incredulity. Alara nodded, clasping her hands lightly in front of her. Yes, I specialize in frost magic. The guard's expression shifted into something distinctly condescending. He handed the adventurer cards back to Cedric with a scoff and crossed his arms. A D-rank rogue mage, he said, his voice loud enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby recruits. Right? That's a new one. Alara stiffened, her cheeks burning, but she kept her composure. I assure you, I'm no imposter. You're wasting your breath, the guard interrupted, shaking his head with a sneer. Mages don't crawl out of the dirt. If you were a real mage, you'd have a noble's crest or a mage tower insignia. You don't look like either. This isn't a place for amateurs playing dress-up. Cedric's jaw tightened, his grip on his sword visibly tightening. Watch your tongue, he growled. Lady Alara is more capable than most here. The guard raised an eyebrow at him, unimpressed. A loyal lapdog, eh? Listen, kid, this isn't some backwater village. This is an expedition under the Thaddeus Duchy's banner. Impersonating a mage here isn't just foolish. It's dangerous. You should have done a better job at your act. Alara took a step forward, her head held high despite the insult. I don't need to prove anything to you, she said, her voice steady. Oh, you don't? The guard retorted. Then don't be surprised when the captain tosses you out on your... Before he could finish, the air around Alara turned icy. A sharp chill swept over the courtyard, drawing startled gasps from nearby adventurers. The guard froze mid-sentence as shimmering frost began to coalesce in the air around Alara's outstretched hand. Within seconds, the frost condensed into a crystalline spear, its sharp edges glittering ominously in the torchlight. The spear hovered for a moment before hurtling forward, streaking through the air like a comet. Swoosh! The frost spear grazed past the guard, so close that the icy chill left a faint sheen of frost on his cheek. It embedded itself into the wall behind him with a resounding crack, shattering into a spray of sparkling ice shards. The guard staggered back, his eyes wide with shock as he touched his frozen cheek. "What the—" "I suggest," Alara said, her voice cold and cutting, "that you think twice before accusing someone of impersonating a mage." The courtyard had gone silent, all eyes on her. Cedric stepped forward, placing a hand on Alara's shoulder in a silent gesture of restraint, though the pride in his expression was unmistakable. The guard's face twisted briefly, a flash of indignation crossing his features, but it vanished almost as quickly as it had come. He straightened his posture, brushing a hand over his frost-slicked cheek and exhaling sharply. The courtyard was still silent, the tension thick in the air as every eye remained on him. With a grudging nod, he lowered his gaze briefly toward Alara. "I stand corrected," he said, his voice steady but lacking the condescension from earlier. "You've made your point, mage." Cedric's eyes narrowed slightly, watching the guard's movements with suspicion, but Alara remained composed, her frosty demeanor fading into a calm, quiet confidence. She didn't gloat or press further, simply inclining her head slightly in acknowledgement. The guard turned to Cedric next, his tone more measured now. "Both of you follow me. I'll take you to Captain Edrin." Without waiting for a response, he pivoted sharply on his heel and began walking toward the building's entrance. Alara and Cedric exchanged a glance before following, the silence around them breaking as the onlookers murmured and whispered among themselves. "Arrogant bastard," Cedric said under his breath, his expression still looking angry. He really wanted to show this guard his place, but since Alara didn't mention anything, he refrained from acting rashly. As they approached the large double doors leading into the recruitment station, the guard's pace remained brisk. His demeanor, though stiff, had shifted. There was no lingering arrogance, only a sense of professional duty as he escorted them. Inside, the station was just as lively as the courtyard. Adventurers and mercenaries of all kinds bustled about, some standing in lines while others reviewed maps pinned to the walls. The scent of ink, parchment, and oil from nearby lanterns filled the air. At the far end of the room, a large desk was stationed where a man in polished armor sat, his presence commanding yet approachable. The guard stopped a few paces from the desk, turning to address the two newcomers. "Captain Edrin is ahead. Present yourselves directly to him." Alara nodded curtly. "Thank you." The guard hesitated for a moment, then inclined his head slightly toward her. "Good luck on the expedition. You'll need it." With that, he stepped aside, his posture still tense but devoid of hostility. Cedric watched him for a moment before leading Alara toward the captain. Chapter 357. Recruitment 2. Captain Edrin looked up from a stack of documents as they approached, his sharp eyes quickly assessing the pair. His silver-gray hair and a faint scar running across his jawline spoke of years of experience, and the faint aura of authority around him was unmistakable. "You're here for the expedition?" Edrin asked, his voice steady and direct. "Yes, Captain," Alara said, stepping forward. "My name is Alara, and this is Cedric. We've come to join." Edrin's gaze flicked briefly to Cedric, then back to Alara. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her, a glimmer of curiosity evident. "A mage?" Alara nodded. "Yes. Frost magic." Edrin leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Interesting. We don't see many rogue mages, especially not ones with enough nerve to come here." His tone wasn't dismissive, but neither was it overly welcoming. But then his eyes gleamed with a faint spark of amusement as he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. "I've heard you've already made an impression in the city," he remarked, his tone casual but probing. Alara's shoulders stiffened immediately, the faintest flicker of unease crossing her features. She hadn't expected anyone outside the courtyard to know about the incident so soon. Was the citizens from yesterday already spreading tales? Or was it just the nature of a city as vibrant and gossipy as Stormhaven? Noticing her reaction, Edrin's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Winds are quite strong in this city, Miss Alara, he said, his voice light with humor. News spreads fast. I see we have quite a strong-spirited young lady here. Alara straightened her posture, the unease fading as her determination took hold. I can't stand injustice to women, she replied simply, her tone calm but resolute. Idren regarded her for a moment, his smile fading into something more serious. Injustice to women? That is a rash path, he said, his tone laced with warning. Alara met his gaze directly, her blue eyes unwavering. That is a path that I am willing to take. Idren's expression softened slightly, though his gaze remained sharp. Is that so? Then so be it. He leaned back again, crossing his arms as he studied her more intently. But words only go so far. I'll need to see for myself what you can do. Not much, just a glimpse of your abilities. Enough to understand the foundation you're working with. Alara hesitated briefly, then gave a firm nod. Understood. Idren gestured toward a clear area in the center of the room, where other adventurers were undergoing physical and magical tests. The space was marked with scorch marks, cracks in the stone floor, and faint remnants of magical residue, evidence of prior demonstrations. Mages tend to be stingy with their spells, Idren added, a wry smile tugging at his lips. So don't feel the need to go all out. A quick showcase will suffice. Alara stepped into the designated area, drawing her hood back slightly to give herself more freedom to move. Her hands hovered at her sides, and she drew in a steadying breath, centering herself. Cedric watched silently from the sidelines, his posture relaxed but his eyes keenly observing. He knew Alara's abilities well, but he also understood the importance of this moment for her. It wasn't just about impressing Idren. It was about proving to herself that she was ready. Alara's mana flowed effortlessly, her body humming with the familiar sensation of frost magic. She extended her hand, and in an instant, a thin sheet of ice spread across the ground, glimmering faintly under the torchlight. The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly, and a faint mist rose from the frozen surface. With a sharp motion, she clenched her fist. From the ice sheet erupted a series of crystalline spikes, each perfectly formed and razor-sharp. They shot upward, stopping just short of the ceiling, before shimmering and dissolving into a soft cascade of snowflakes. The demonstration lasted mere seconds, but the precision and control were undeniable. Idren's eyes narrowed slightly, his analytical gaze taking in every detail. After a moment, he nodded slowly. Efficient, controlled. A good start. It appears that your master is quite a fine mage. Alara's posture tensed almost imperceptibly as Captain Idren's words settled over the room. Her blue eyes widened slightly, and for a split second, her calm composure faltered. How did he know about her master? Had she given herself away somehow? Was it truly that obvious? Idren, catching the flicker of unease in her expression, broke into a hearty laugh, the deep sound filling the space. Relax, young lady, he said, his tone carrying a surprising warmth. Even if it wasn't obvious, you've just made it so. Alara blinked, her cheeks flushing faintly. She opened her mouth to respond, but Idren raised a hand, still smiling. Seeing rogue mages is a rare occasion. He continued, his voice steady and thoughtful. That's especially true for someone your age, and with that level of control. It doesn't take much to deduce that someone guided you. I've been doing this long enough to know the marks of good teaching when I see them. She ducked her head slightly, trying to compose herself. The compliment felt both validating and a little overwhelming. I suppose that makes sense, she said softly, her voice tinged with flustered humility. Idren watched her closely, his sharp gaze softening. You're young, but you're not lacking in spirit. I respect that. He leaned back slightly, his arms crossing again. And don't worry, I'm not interested in prying into your past. You've got your reasons for being here, and that's enough for me. Alara glanced up at him, her blush deepening. There was something unexpectedly kind in the captain's demeanor, a sense of fairness that put her slightly at ease. Despite his earlier sternness, he carried himself with a balance of authority and approachability that felt almost paternal. For a moment, She wondered if this was why so many adventurers seemed to trust him. "Thank you, Captain," she managed, her voice more composed now. Idris smiled faintly, a glint of amusement still lingering in his eyes. "Save the thanks for later. You're just getting started. And trust me, the challenges ahead won't care if you've got a good teacher or not. It's your own strength and resolve that'll see you through." Elara nodded firmly, her resolve strengthening. "I'll remember that." Cedric, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward slightly, a glare on his face. He looked rather gruff and angry. "She is already proving herself. She will not stop here." Idrin's gaze snapped to Cedric, the warmth in his expression vanishing in an instant. His sharp, cold eyes bore into the night, carrying an unspoken challenge. Cedric, undeterred, met Idrin's gaze head-on, his jaw tightening as he refused to back down. For a tense moment, silence fell between them. Then, without warning, the long sword at Idrin's side hissed free of its scabbard. The blade gleamed in the torchlight as it sliced through the air in a swift, controlled arc. Clang! Cedric reacted on instinct, drawing his own blade and intercepting Idrin's strike at the last possible moment. The force of the clash sent a reverberating shock down his arms, and he stumbled back a step, his balance momentarily faltering. Idrin held his stance for a beat longer, the tip of his sword pointed toward Cedric's chest, before smoothly retracting his blade. He sheathed it in a single fluid motion, his expression unreadable. "A knight that speaks unnecessarily is a burden," Idrin said, his voice cold and clipped. His eyes lingered on Cedric, their sharpness unwavering. "Focus on protecting your lady. That is your role." Cedric's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, a thin bead of sweat trailing down his temple. His grip on his sword tightened, but he didn't reply, understanding the weight behind Idrin's words. Slowly he straightened, lowering his blade. Idrin turned his back on them, his steps deliberate as he moved toward his desk. "You will be assigned to the fourth group," he said over his shoulder, his tone leaving no room for argument. Cedric's knuckles whitened around the hilt of his sword, but he held his tongue. Elara, watching the exchange with wide eyes, placed a hand lightly on his arm. "Cedric," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. He glanced at her, his tension easing slightly as he met her gaze. With a curt nod, he sheathed his sword and stepped back, his usual composure slowly returning. Idrin didn't look back as he addressed them one last time. "Report to the fourth station for briefing. Walk just straight, then turn right. You will see the sign for the fourth station." Elara and Cedric nodded curtly at Idrin's dismissal and began making their way toward the exit. Cedric's steps were heavy, his frustration still evident, but Alara's mind was already preoccupied with the events that had just transpired. As they neared the threshold, movement near the entrance caught Alara's attention. She glanced toward the recruitment desk and froze, her heart skipping a beat. There, standing before the same guard who had questioned her earlier, was a young man with pitch-black eyes and unruly dark hair. "That's him. The one from the inn," Elara thought, her breath catching for a moment. Her memory of his wide-eyed stare resurfaced, along with the brief but curious encounter. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite place. Without thinking, she slowed her steps and focused her senses, honing in on the exchange at the desk. The faint hum of the room dulled around her as she tuned in on the conversation. "ID?" the guard asked, his tone brisk. The young man produced a small card, sliding it across the counter. "Here." The guard picked it up, his eyes scanning the information. Name Luca. Adventurer rank. D. A swordsman. Luca, Elara repeated in her mind, committing the name to memory. There was one name that came into her mind, but she would rather forget that. It can't be. Her gaze remained locked on him, taking in his relaxed yet confident posture. His cat, still perched on his shoulder, flicked its tail lazily, its serene demeanor contrasting with the bustling recruitment station. Just then, for a split second, their eyes met. Pitch-black eyes. Bright blue eyes. As they locked, Elara for some reason felt the need to avert her gaze, but she stumbled a little on the process. Cedric noticed her stumble. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Nothing. Let's go." And just like that, they left. Chapter 358. Recruitment 3. As Lucavion handed his ID to the guard, Vitaliera perched lazily on his shoulder, her ethereal form glowing faintly under the torchlight. The guard examined the card, his expression neutral. Name: Luca. Adventurer rank: D. A swordsman. The guard read aloud before nodding and sliding the ID back across the counter. "You're clear. Head straight, you will meet with Captain Edrin." Lucavion inclined his head in a gesture of thanks, his usual smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Taking his ID, he tucked it neatly into his coat and stepped through the gates, his stride relaxed yet deliberate. As they passed into the bustling recruitment area, Vitaliera shifted on his shoulder, her glowing eyes narrowing as she turned her gaze toward the blonde girl exiting the room. "Isn't that the girl from the inn?" she asked, her voice quiet but pointed. Lucavion didn't miss a step, his smile never faltering. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied smoothly, his tone nonchalant. "Liar." Vitaliera shot back, her tail flicking with subtle agitation. "You recognized her. I felt it." Lucavion gave a soft chuckle, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention. "I think you're imagining things, my dear." But Vitaliera wasn't convinced. Her translucent form pulsed faintly as her gaze lingered on the retreating figure of Alara. "There's something peculiar about her," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Something familiar, but different." Lucavion's face flickered for the briefest of moments, but he quickly masked it with an exaggerated yawn. "You're overthinking, as usual." "No, I'm not," Vitaliera insisted, her tone sharpening. "I sensed it. It's not like when I first met you, when you were using starlight as your mana. This girl's energy is strange, compound, integrated into herself in a way I can't quite place." Lucavion remained silent, his steps unchanging as they moved through the recruitment hall. Vitaliera's tail curled slightly around his neck, her glowing eyes narrowing further as she studied his expression, or rather, his carefully maintained lack of one. "You're hiding something, Lucavion," she said quietly, "and I'm going to find out what it is." Lucavion's smirk returned, faint and enigmatic. "Good luck with that," he said, his voice carrying a playful lilt. "Now let's focus. We've got an expedition to join, remember?" Vitaliera huffed softly but said nothing more, her glowing form settling into a thoughtful silence. Familiar, yet different, she thought again, her tail flicking with restless curiosity. "Just who are you, and why does he seem so intent on pretending you don't exist?" Lucavion strode into the room, his steps unhurried but deliberate, as if the bustling energy of the recruitment area had no hold over him. The chamber he entered was more subdued, the air heavy with an unspoken authority that emanated from the man standing at its center, Captain Edrin. The moment Lucavion stepped inside, a subtle pressure brushed against him, not oppressive, but sharp, like the edge of a well-honed blade. His instincts, honed through years of battle and survival, flared in response. As expected, he is strong, Lucavion thought, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the man before him. Captain Edrin stood tall and composed, his silver-gray hair and the faint scar on his jawline adding to his aura of experience. But it wasn't just his presence that caught Lucavion's attention. It was the subtle flow of energy radiating from him, restrained yet unmistakably potent. At least a 6th rank awakened, Lucavion calculated inwardly, or perhaps even peak 6th rank. He allowed his gaze to sweep over the man, noting the way Edrin carried himself. His strength wasn't just in his rank. It was in the way his aura harmonized with his physicality, a mark of someone who had honed their abilities through countless battles. "It's been a while since my senses warned me like this," Lucavion mused, a faint thrill stirring within him. His fingers twitched faintly at his sides, an almost imperceptible reaction to the unspoken question that lingered in his mind. How would it feel if we were to fight? Before his thoughts could wander further, Captain Edrin's voice cut through the air like a whip. "All of the weirdos are coming today. It seems His tone was gruff, edged with a dry sarcasm. His sharp gray eyes fixed on Lucavion with a penetrating intensity. "Do you want to die, kid?" Lucavion blinked, his smirk faltering for the briefest moment. Cease your intent," Idrin said bluntly, his gaze unwavering. Lucavion raised an eyebrow, feigning ignorance as he tilted his head slightly. "Intent? Yes, you are oozing intent." Lucavion's face softened slightly as he tilted his head, his dark eyes narrowing faintly in confusion. "Intent?" he repeated, his tone laced with genuine curiosity. "I wasn't aware I was exuding any." Idrin's sharp gray eyes didn't waver, his stance unmoving and resolute. "Don't think that your sword intent is only limited to the mana drawn from your core," he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of years of understanding. "There's a reason why it's called intent." The words hung in the air, pointed yet deliberately incomplete, as if Idrin were handing Lucavion the missing piece of a puzzle. He fixed his gaze on Lucavion, his silence a clear invitation to figure it out yourself. Lucavion's smile faded entirely as he met Idrin's unrelenting gaze, the pieces slowly clicking into place. The weight of realization settled over him, subtle but undeniable, as his thoughts pieced together the captain's cryptic words. "I see," he thought, his eyes flickering with newfound understanding. The mana around him, the faint currents of the world itself, was subtly responding to his unspoken thoughts. His idle musings of testing Idrin's strength, of imagining a clash between them, had unconsciously bled into the energy he carried. It wasn't bloodthirst or malice, but a subtle projection of his inner self, amplified by his connection to the blade. "That's why people avoid me when I'm armed," he realized, a faint tinge of exasperation coloring his thoughts. Sigh. How stupid. I'd always assumed it was because I looked handsome. A flicker of amusement returned to his features as he straightened slightly, schooling his expression into something more neutral. "But then again, I would assume this can be avoided with just this." A thought occurred in his mind. If the reason for this intent phenomenon to occur was related to mana and his thoughts, there were simply two things that could be done. Either he would need to remove the variables from this situation. One variable was thoughts, and thoughts wouldn't be stopped. That is why he simply separated his thoughts from his mana. The subtle hum in the air stilled, and the oppressive edge of his presence dissolved like a dissipating fog. Idrin's sharp eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise breaking through his stoic expression. "Did you do that intentionally?" he asked, his tone edged with disbelief. Lucavion tilted his head, his smirk returning as he feigned ignorance. "Do what, Captain?" Idrin's expression darkened, his voice lowering with a touch of warning. "Don't play with me, boy. You must be misunderstanding something," Lucavion replied smoothly, his tone light and disarming. He brushed an invisible speck of dust from his coat, his demeanor utterly unbothered. Idrin clicked his tongue, his sharp gaze narrowing on Lucavion. "TCH, let's not waste any more time. What is your name?" Lucavion paused for a split second, his dark eyes flickering with amusement as he adjusted his reply. Luca. Luca, Idrin repeated, his tone laced with suspicion as he studied the young man before him. "Yes," Lucavion confirmed, his smirk unwavering. "Luca, a simple name for a simple swordsman." Idrin's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, as though weighing the truth of his words. Finally, the captain exhaled sharply, a faint sneer tugging at his lips. "You're a strange one, Luca. Keep your tricks in check or you'll regret it." "Understood, Captain. I'll do my best to behave." Swoosh! Just as Lucavion's lips parted to deliver another quip, a sharp swish of air cut through the room. Without warning, a blade descended in a swift, calculated arc. Clank! The metallic clash reverberated through the chamber as Lucavion's hand moved instinctively. His own blade, drawn in a blur of motion, intercepted Idrin's strike with precision. Despite the suddenness of the attack, Lucavion stood firm, his balance unwavering as his dark eyes locked onto Idrin's. For a moment, the two swords remained crossed, a faint hum of tension filling the air. Then Idrin leaned back slightly, his blade withdrawing with a deliberate motion. "Not bad," he said, his tone carrying a faint edge of approval. Lucavion smirked, lowering his blade with an easy grace before sheathing it smoothly. "I'll take that as a compliment, Captain." Idrin eyed him critically, his sharp gaze scrutinizing every detail of Lucavion's stance and reaction. "Quick hands, steady footing, and you didn't lose your cool," he remarked, his voice steady. "But don't let it go to your head. That was a test, not a fight." Lucavion inclined his head slightly. "Of course, Captain. A test of reflexes, I assume." Idrin didn't reply immediately. Instead, he tapped the flat of his blade against his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "More than that, it's also a measure of restraint. Plenty of swordsmen can draw their blades quickly, but only a few can do it without losing themselves to instinct. You held firm." Lucavion chuckled softly, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. "I appreciate the evaluation. I take it I passed." Idrin's lips twitched into a faint smirk, though it barely softened the sharpness of his gaze. "You've got potential, but potential alone won't get you far on this expedition." He turned away, his tone cooling as he added, "Head to the 3rd station. Walk straight and then turn right, you will see the sign." Chapter 359, 4th Station. "You've got potential, but potential alone won't get you far on this expedition. Head to the 3rd station. Walk straight and then turn right, you will see the sign." Lucavion inclined his head at Idrin's directions, but the faintest furrow creased his brow. His sharp memory immediately recalled the path the blonde girl and her companion had taken earlier. They turned left, he thought, the detail standing out like a ripple in still water. For a moment, his mind turned the observation over, questioning its significance. Idrin had directed him to the 3rd station, straight ahead and to the right. Yet the pair from earlier had clearly gone left. Was it a coincidence? Or had they been assigned to a different group entirely? Lucavion kept his expression neutral, offering a faint smirk as he responded. "Understood, Captain. I'll head there right away." Idrin gave a curt nod, his focus already shifting back to the papers on his desk. Turning on his heel, Lucavion strode out of the chamber, his steps deliberate but unhurried. Vital Yara's voice brushed against his thoughts as he exited into the bustling hallway. "Something bothering you?" "Not particularly," he replied, his tone calm but edged with faint curiosity. Lucavion walked with purpose, his dark eyes scanning the hallway as he approached the next guard station. He inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement to the guard, who stepped aside without a word. Instead of turning right as instructed, Lucavion smoothly veered left, his steps unhurried but deliberate. "Where are you going?" Vital Yara's voice chimed in, her tone suspicious. "Didn't he say to turn right?" Lucavion smiled faintly, his tone light. "Well, let's say I don't like following orders." "Oh, I know you don't like following orders," Vitaliera retorted, her glowing form shifting on his shoulder. "But you're also not someone who'd go against them just for the sake of it." Lucavion chuckled softly, his smirk deepening. What are you implying, my dear?" There was a pause before Vitaliera replied, her voice quieter but sharper. "That girl, are you following her trail?" Lucavion's face didn't falter, though a glimmer of amusement sparked in his eyes. "Wherever did you get that idea?" He continued down the left hallway, his eyes scanning the signs along the walls. The passage was quieter here, with fewer adventurers milling about. His gaze caught 2 signs at a junction ahead, 4th station and 2nd station, each pointing in a different direction. Lucavion slowed his pace slightly, his expression thoughtful. Which one did they go to? He wondered silently. 4th, Vitaliera answered for him, her tone confident. "While you entered, I looked for that girl. She went this way." Lucavion raised an eyebrow, his smirk softening into something more contemplative. "You've been busy, haven't you?" he thought, his tone carrying a hint of teasing. "Someone has to keep an eye on your distractions," Vitaliera replied with a flick of her tail. "Now, are you going? Or are you going to stand here pondering like an idiot?" "Why mad?" I am not mad. Mad? Lucavion adjusted his coat and stepped into the room marked 4th station. The space was modest, filled with neatly arranged desks and shelves stacked with scrolls and ledgers. At the far side of the room, a man sat behind a heavy wooden desk, scribbling notes into a logbook. Lucavion's sharp eyes scanned the man briefly, taking in his composed demeanor and the faint but unmistakable air of discipline. From the looks of it, this guy is also a knight, he thought, noting the upright posture and the faint scars visible along the man's forearms. The knight glanced up as Lucavion entered, his expression neutral but observant. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone formal but not unfriendly. Lucavion offered a polite nod, his smirk faint but present. "Luca," he said smoothly, "Captain Edrin sent me here to register for the expedition." The man raised an eyebrow slightly, then set down his quill and gestured toward the desk in front of him. "Take a seat." Lucavion complied, sliding into the chair with an effortless grace as he placed his ID on the desk. The knight picked it up, his eyes scanning the details quickly before setting it aside. "Name? Luca. Adventurer rank. D. Occupation. Swordsman. Is that correct?" "Spot on," Lucavion replied with a faint smirk. The knight gave a curt nod and began filling out a form with practiced efficiency. His quill scratched against the parchment as he asked a few standard questions: emergency contact, prior experience, and whether Lucavion had any medical conditions that could affect the expedition. Lucavion answered each question with his usual nonchalance, keeping his responses concise but cooperative. It didn't take long before the knight set down his quill and rolled up the completed form. He tucked it into a cylindrical holder before turning back to Lucavion. "Your registration is complete," the knight said, his tone businesslike. "You'll receive further instructions at the briefing. Stay alert and prepared." Lucavion inclined his head slightly as he stood. "Understood. Thank you." The knight nodded once more before returning to his logbook, his attention already shifting back to his work. As Lucavion stepped out of the station, Vitalyara's voice drifted into his mind. "That was surprisingly uneventful." "Sometimes, my dear, efficiency is its own kind of art," Lucavion replied, his smirk deepening slightly as he adjusted his coat. "Efficiency?" Vitalyara's tone carried a note of teasing. "I'm sure you were just hoping to see her again." Lucavion chuckled softly, his pace unchanging as he moved down the corridor. "You really are mistaking it. If you were me, what would you think?" Lucavion chuckled softly as he adjusted his coat, his pace unhurried as he moved through the corridor. "If I were in your position, my dear," he began smoothly, "I'd likely think I was following that girl too." "See?" Vitalyara shot back, her tone triumphant but laced with curiosity. "So, you admit it?" Lucavion's smirk deepened, a flicker of mischief gleaming in his dark eyes. But that would only be the case if I were a normal guy. And you're not." Vitalyara's glowing form flickered as she tilted her head, her voice carrying a note of skepticism. "Last I checked, you can bleed like everyone else." "True enough," Lucavion conceded, his tone light, "but we both know I'm not normal, right? If I were following her, it wouldn't be for the reasons you're assuming. It would be for something different." "Then what might that reason be?" Vitalyara pressed, her glowing eyes narrowing as her tail flicked lightly against his neck. Lucavion's face softened into something more enigmatic, his gaze flickering with amusement. "As I said before, my dear, that's for you to figure out. I really can't remember how much I say this, but you are impossible," Vitalyara muttered, her tone exasperated but tinged with reluctant fondness. "You know that, right?" Lucavion laughed softly, his dark eyes scanning the hallways ahead as he continued toward the briefing. "And yet, you still can't help but stay curious. Isn't that why we make such a perfect pair?" Vitalyara huffed, her glowing form settling back into its usual perch on his shoulder. "Perfectly infuriating, you mean?" Lucavion didn't reply immediately, his smirk lingering as his thoughts wandered. The truth, of course, was far more layered than he let on. But for now, letting Vitalyara chase her own theories was half the fun. Lucavion exited the camp, the city of Stormhaven opening before him in all its vibrancy. The salty breeze from the ocean teased his senses, mingling with the scents of freshly baked bread, sizzling meats, and tangy spices wafting from street stalls. The rhythmic clinking of metal from blacksmiths' forges blended with the hum of voices bartering, laughing, and occasionally shouting in the market square. For a brief moment, Lucavion stood still, taking it all in. His hand lingered near his collar as a faint smile crept onto his lips. Ocean, chaotic yet soothing in its way. A coffee would be nice, he mused, the thought bringing a touch of familiarity to the foreign surroundings. It wasn't a grand request, but there was something grounding about the idea of a steaming cup of coffee amid the city's bustle. Coffee? Now? In all this noise? Vital Yara's voice chimed in, a touch of amusement laced with skepticism. You really are an odd one, Lucavion. He chuckled softly, his dark eyes scanning the streets. Odd, am I? Or just a man who knows what he wants? Oh, please, you're about as simple as a 12-piece puzzle made of glass. Flattery will get you nowhere, he replied with a smirk, his voice low enough not to draw attention as he moved deeper into the market. But try as he might, no enticing aroma of coffee wafted through the air. Instead, he found himself drawn into the maze of colorful stalls and wandering merchants, each one promising something rarer or more exotic than the last. Among the crowd, he noticed a small booth tucked into the corner of the square, its wares shrouded in shadow beneath a tattered awning. Intrigued, he approached, his gaze flickering over the items laid out with care. Vials of swirling liquids, charms inscribed with runes, and small pouches of herbs that seemed to exude a faint, otherworldly glow. Well, he murmured, his fingers brushing against the edge of a charm. And what treasures do we have here? The merchant, an older man with sharp, piercing eyes, looked up from his seat. Only the finest, traveler. These are no ordinary trinkets. They're crafted with precision and blessed by the artisans of Lorien. Lorien, you say? Lucavion's brow arched slightly as he turned the charm over in his hand. Yet I don't see their mark. Odd for something blessed by such renowned hands. The merchant hesitated, a flicker of nervousness crossing his face before he quickly recovered. But that's because these are rare, made for the discreet buyer. Their value lies in their secrecy. Caught you there. Lucavion set the charm back down, his smirk never faltering. Discretion has its price, he replied smoothly, but so does honesty. With a slight incline of his head, he stepped away, leaving the merchant to sputter excuses to the next curious passerby. You could have called him out more directly, you know? Vitaliera teased, her tail flicking lightly against his shoulder. Why let him off so easily? Because, my dear, the best way to disarm a liar is to leave him wondering how much you know, Lucavion replied, his tone casual but laced with amusement. Besides, I'm still on a mission. A mission for coffee? Truly noble. Where will you find such a noble guy such myself? Vitalyara's face twitched at that remark. If you were a noble, everyone would be one. Though she didn't say this part. Chapter 360. Here are the things. The following day, Lucavion stepped into the bustling guild hall, his sharp gaze immediately sweeping over the lively scene before him. The room was packed, a cacophony of laughter, shouting, and the occasional clink of glasses filling the air. Adventurers of all shapes and sizes clustered around the tables, some sharing tales of their exploits, others locked in arm-wrestling contests that sent fists crashing onto wooden surfaces. Lucavion adjusted his coat as he moved further into the room, his dark eyes flicking over the unfamiliar faces. The people here had a distinct look, coastal, with a ruggedness honed by the sea. Their attire reflected the influence of the ocean that defined Stormhaven's identity. Men sported open vests or shirts, their chests bare and bronzed from long days under the sun. Women wore light, flowing garments that bared their shoulders and arms, some even their midriffs. The fabrics were vibrant, dyed in rich blues, greens, and whites that mirrored the colors of the waves. Quite the display, Vitaliera remarked, her glowing eyes scanning the room from her perch on his shoulder. It's a far cry from the more reserved styles we've seen inland. Indeed, Lucavion replied, his tone light but thoughtful. The sea leaves its mark on everything, doesn't it? Including the people. His gaze lingered on a group of adventurers at a nearby table. They were pirates, or at least heavily influenced by the culture. Laughing raucously as one of them slammed a tankard down, foam spilling over the edges. One of the women in the group threw her head back, her sun-kissed hair catching the light as she laughed, the sound carrying above the din. Lucavion couldn't help but smirk faintly. Lively bunch. And loud, Vitaliera added, her tail flicking slightly in mild exasperation. Though I suppose that's part of their charm. He stepped further into the guild, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. The tables were littered with maps, bottles, and weapons, each object telling a story of the adventurers who owned them. The scent of saltwater and ale mingled with the faint tang of sweat, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts chaotic and invigorating. As he approached the counter, he noted the bulletin board to his left, its surface plastered with notices. Job postings, bounties, and expedition rosters jostled for space, each one scrawled with bold, hurried letters. His sharp eyes caught a few high-paying bounties, but nothing out of the ordinary yet. The guild receptionist, a sharp-eyed woman with dark hair tied back in a practical braid, noticed him coming and glanced up as Lucavion approached. Black hair, black eyes, and scar on the right eye. It is this guy. Please wait a second. The guild receptionist leaned slightly forward, her sharp eyes locking onto Lucavion's distinctive features. Jet black hair, equally dark eyes, and the faint scar etched over his right eye. Her gaze lingered for only a moment before a smile curved her lips, polite yet carrying a hint of intrigue. Mr. Luca, she called, her voice cutting cleanly through the lively din of the guild hall. The sudden attention was palpable. Heads turned, conversations paused, and more than a few adventurers sized him up, their gazes ranging from idle curiosity to subtle scrutiny. Lucavion didn't flinch under the weight of their stares. Instead, he adjusted the cuff of his coat with a faint smirk, his expression calm and unaffected as he approached the counter. The receptionist straightened, her professional demeanor intact. The guild master has been expecting you, she said, her voice clear but tinged with an air of formality. If you'll follow the hallway to the right, her office is at the end. She's waiting for you. Lucavion inclined his head slightly, his dark eyes catching hers for a brief moment. Understood, he replied smoothly. Thank you. She gestured toward the indicated hallway, but before he turned to leave, her gaze softened, a flicker of something akin to amusement or curiosity crossing her features. Good luck, she added, her voice quieter now, as though the words were meant for him alone. Lucavion nodded once more, offering a faint, enigmatic smile before heading toward the hallway. Behind him, the murmurs of the guild resumed, some hushed whispers clearly directed at him. You seem to attract attention wherever you go, Vitaliera remarked, her glowing form shifting slightly on his shoulder. Must be exhausting. Not really. Lucavion reached the end of the hallway and knocked lightly on the polished wooden door. A familiar voice, calm yet tinged with a subtle edge of amusement, called out from within. Come in. He pushed the door open, stepping into the guild master's office. The room was spacious but not ostentatious, with shelves lined with neatly organized books and ledgers. A map of the region dominated one wall, while a large desk occupied the center, papers and ink bottles arranged with meticulous care. Behind the desk sat Corvina, her sharp eyes lifting from the document she'd been reviewing. A smile curled her lips, welcoming yet carrying her usual calculated charm. Mr. Luca, she greeted, rising gracefully to her feet. Punctual as always. A quality I appreciate. Lucavion inclined his head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Guild master, he replied smoothly. A punctual guest is only fair to a gracious host. Corvina chuckled softly, her gaze briefly sweeping over him. Always so eloquent. You know, if you weren't already infamous for your other talents, I'd think you'd make an excellent courtier. Lucavion's smirk deepened as he approached the desk. I'll take that as a compliment, though I can't say I'd enjoy being confined to court. I've always preferred freer surroundings. Her eyes gleamed with amusement as she gestured to the seat before her desk. Please have a seat. Unless, of course, you prefer standing. Lucavion settled into the offered chair, his posture relaxed yet composed. Standing would imply impatience, he said, his tone light. And I find your company quite agreeable. Corvina arched an eyebrow, her smile lingering. Careful, Mr. Luca. Flattery is a dangerous game, especially with someone like me. Lucavion leaned back slightly. And yet, you seem to enjoy playing along. Corvina laughed softly, the sound carrying a touch of warmth before she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. I'll admit, you make it hard not to. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she straightened, her demeanor shifting to something more professional. But let's get to the matter at hand, she said, her voice now steady and businesslike. The materials you requested, they've been gathered. I have to say, your list was quite the challenge. But my people are nothing if not resourceful. Lucavion's dark eyes gleamed faintly as he inclined his head. That's very nice to hear, Guildmaster. You certainly live up to your reputation. Corvina allowed herself a faint smile, leaning back in her chair as she observed him. It's not every day we receive such interesting clients. I make it a point to deliver when the stakes are high. Lucavion's smirk softened into something more contemplative. And when the stakes are interesting, I presume. Precisely, Corvina replied, her tone tinged with playful intrigue. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The materials are ready for your inspection whenever you're prepared. The old man nodded. Yes, in a way. He became so consumed by his own burdens that he couldn't see the bigger picture. He couldn't see that there were others who could share the load, who could understand and support him. And in isolating himself, he lost sight of the connections that could have given his life more meaning. I frowned at the old man's words, trying to digest the implications. His eyes, though weathered and tired, bore into mine with an intensity that made it hard to look away. I don't need anyone's help, I muttered, my voice barely audible. I've managed on my own this long. The old man chuckled softly, the sound of a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the air. Oh, you think you've managed, do you? Survived, perhaps. But have you truly lived, boy? His words grated on my nerves, and I couldn't help but snap back. What would you know about it? You don't know anything about me. Don't I? He replied, a sly smile playing on his lips. I've seen many like you, convinced that their pain is unique, that no one else could possibly understand. But pain, my boy, is the most universal of all experiences. I clenched my jaw, my grip on the spear tightening. I don't need a lecture, I said through gritted teeth. I just need to get stronger. Ah, strength, the old man mused, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. Tell me, do you think strength is merely about muscle and skill? About swinging a spear until your arms ache and your body is drenched in sweat? I didn't answer, but my silence seemed to amuse him. Strength, true strength, comes from understanding, he continued. Understanding your own limits and the limits of others. Understanding that sometimes the greatest strength is in allowing yourself to be vulnerable. I scoffed at that, unable to hide my disdain. Vulnerability is weakness. Is it now? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Tell me, who is stronger? The one who hides their wounds and suffers in silence, or the one who bears their scars and seeks the support they need to heal? I turned away, unwilling to meet his gaze. His words were hitting too close to home, stirring feelings I didn't want to acknowledge. I don't have time for this. It was annoying to the point where I was even considering leaving this place. I came here to get rid of the useless thoughts that were accompanying my head, and now I was met with a lecture instead. Annoying. But why am I even staying here? I asked myself as I grabbed the spear in my hand. Now that I thought about it, was there a need for me to stand here? But why should I leave? It is not like I did anything wrong. For some reason, the fact that I tried to change places made me feel like I was escaping from the old man's words. And that was annoying. Thus, without replying, I decided to grab my spear and continued. But this time, I focused more on my core and technique rather than mindlessly swinging. Until the moment I heard the old man say, "Spear is not a weapon for you."
Hello everyone. We now have a Discord server. Join us for faster updates, discussions about your favorite novels, and exclusive Discord-only content. Don't miss out. See you there. Scan the QR code on the screen or enter any of the displayed links into your browser to join our Discord.